The first bullet punched through the saloon window before anyone heard the shot. Glass exploded inward like 1,000 tiny daggers, catching the afternoon light for one brilliant moment before scattering across the sawdust floor. Caleb Morgan hit the ground on pure instinct, the same instinct that had kept him breathing through 3 years of war. 3 years of watching boys become corpses. 3 years of learning that hesitation was just another word for death. He was 42 years old now. Gray touched his temples like frost creeping across a window pane. His knees ached on cold mornings, and his back carried the memory of a Confederate bayonet that had come within an inch of ending his story at Antietam. But his reflexes, those still belonged to the soldier he had never stopped being. 2 more rounds tore through the wooden walls, splintering the bar counter into kindling. A woman screamed somewhere behind him, high and sharp, the sound of pure terror. Men scrambled for cover, knocking over chairs, diving behind poker tables, crawling toward the back door on their hands and knees. Caleb drew his Colt single-action army from the worn leather holster at his hip. The Peacemaker, folks called it, 7.5-inch barrel, .45 caliber. Walnut grip worn smooth by 12 years of constant use. He had carried this particular weapon since 1873, and in all that time, through all the trouble he had seen, it had never once failed him. Through the shattered window, he spotted 3 riders in the street, bandanas pulled high over their faces, hiding everything but their eyes. Winchesters raised and steady, the barrels still smoking from the first volley. Their horses stamped and snorted in the dust, sensing the violence that crackled in the air like summer lightning before a storm. These men were not here to rob the saloon. They were here to kill. Caleb rolled behind an overturned poker table, feeling cards and chips scatter beneath his weight. He steadied his breathing, in through the nose, out through the mouth, just like the old sergeant had taught him back in '62, and fired twice in rapid succession. The first shot took the lead rider's hat clean off his head, spinning it away into the wind. The second caught his horse in the shoulder. The animal screamed, a terrible, almost human sound, and reared violently, throwing its rider face first into the packed dirt of Main Street. The other 2 scattered like startled quail, spurring their mounts in opposite directions while firing wild. Bullets chewed into the saloon walls, throwing splinters and plaster dust into the air. A mirror behind the bar exploded. Someone was praying loudly in Spanish near the back door. Then a voice cut through the chaos. Calm, commanding, familiar as Caleb's own heartbeat. "Caleb! Flank left!" The back door crashed open hard enough to splinter the frame. Silas Wade burst through with his Spencer, repeating rifle already barking fire, working the lever action with the smooth efficiency of a man who had done this 1,000 times before. Silas was 48 years old, gray at the temples, built like an ox that had weathered too many hard winters and come out stronger for it. He moved with the deliberate economy of someone who had learned exactly how much motion was necessary to end a fight, and not 1 inch more. They had been young men together once, young and foolish and full of righteous fire, marching east from Arizona Territory to save the Union. They had stood shoulder to shoulder at Gettysburg when Pickett's 15,000 came screaming up Cemetery Ridge. Wave after wave of gray uniforms and rebel yells and bayonets gleaming in the summer sun. They had held the line when boys all around them were falling like wheat before a scythe. Some bonds are forged in blood. Those bonds never break. The crossfire caught the remaining attackers completely off guard. One took a round from Silas's Spencer directly in the thigh and dropped his Winchester with a howl of pain, clutching at the wound as dark blood welled between his fingers. The third attacker, the smart one, wheeled his horse hard, spurred the animal viciously, and fled into the desert haze without looking back. Silence settled over Dusty Creek, the kind of silence that follows violence, heavy, watchful, full of dust and gun smoke and the copper smell of fresh blood. Caleb rose slowly from behind the ruined poker table. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, ejecting spent brass, thumbing fresh rounds into the cylinder, spinning it closed with a flick of his wrist. His fingers did not shake. They never had, even when they probably should have. Silas approached, his rifle barrel still smoking faintly in the cool air. His eyes swept the street through the broken window, checking for additional threats. "You recognize them?" Caleb nodded once, his jaw tight enough to crack walnuts. Blackwood's men. Silas spat into the sawdust floor. Son of a bitch finally made his move. Victor Blackwood. The name sat in Caleb's chest like a stone he had been carrying for 12 long years. Blackwood had been Confederate cavalry during the war, a captain in the Virginia 1st, who had surrendered at Appomattox with hatred still burning white-hot in his heart. When the guns fell silent and the South lay in ruins, Victor had come west with Southern money, Southern connections, and Southern grudges that time had done absolutely nothing to soften. He bought land, he bought cattle, he bought lawmen and judges and politicians and anyone else whose loyalty came with a price tag attached. And for more than a decade, he had been circling Caleb Morgan's ranch like a vulture waiting for something to die. Not because the land was particularly valuable, not because it sat on water or gold or anything else worth killing over. No. Victor Blackwood wanted that land because Caleb Morgan had worn Union blue, because Caleb had fought on the winning side, because Victor Blackwood was the kind of man who kept score, and he had been losing for 20 years. Some men learn to let go of the past, others let the past poison everything they touch. Sheriff Tom Grady pushed through the gathering crowd outside the saloon, his hand hovering near his holster in a way that was meant to look authoritative, but came across as nervous instead. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool afternoon air. "What happened here, Morgan?" Caleb stepped out onto the boardwalk, boots crunching on broken glass. "3 men tried to kill me. One's wounded in the street. The other 2 ran." Grady glanced at the groaning man lying in the dust, still clutching his bleeding thigh. Recognition flickered in the sheriff's eyes. And then something else. Fear. "That's probably just some drifter," Grady said, not meeting Caleb's gaze. "Got drunk, started shooting at shadows. He's wearing Blackwood's brand on his saddle, Tom." The sheriff's face went the color of old ash. "I'll look into it," Grady muttered, already backing away. "You do that." Caleb did not wait for an answer. There was no point. Tom Grady had been in Victor Blackwood's pocket for years. Everyone in town knew it, even if nobody had the courage to say it out loud. He mounted his horse, a 15-hand buckskin gelding named Sergeant. The animal was steady and battle-tested, loyal in the way that only a good horse can be. He had carried Caleb through sandstorms and gunfights alike without ever once losing his nerve. Silas swung up onto his own mount. "I'll ride out to your place tonight. We need to talk strategy. Bring ammunition." And Caleb, Silas lowered his voice, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. "There's been talk in town. Word is a federal marshal's been poking around the territory lately, asking questions about land deals, about Blackwood." Caleb filed that information away. Might mean something, might mean nothing. Either way, he had more immediate problems. 2 miles from the ranch, movement near the creek caught his eye. His hand dropped to his Colt. A figure emerged from the brush. Young, Apache by the look of her. Black braids hanging past her shoulders, a hunting bow gripped in one weathered hand. She was dragging something behind her through the tall grass. A dead coyote. The same damn coyote that had been picking off Caleb's chickens for the better part of 3 weeks. She looked up at him without a trace of fear in her dark eyes. "Your fence is broken," she said. Her English was clear, touched with an accent that spoke of campfires and open sky, and a life lived far from white man's towns. 3 posts down on the east side. That's how the coyote was getting in. Caleb studied her for a long moment. She was young, early 20s maybe, thin in the way of someone who had been surviving on whatever the land provided. But there was a steadiness in her posture that had nothing to do with age. "You killed it?" "I did." "Why?" She shrugged slightly. "It was killing your animals, and I needed to eat." He almost smiled. "Almost. What's your name?" "Kaya." "You got a place to stay?" "Kaya?" "No." Caleb looked at her. Really looked. And he recognized something in those dark eyes that he knew all too well. The look of someone who had learned to survive alone because the world had given her no other choice. The look of someone who expected nothing from anyone because expecting things only led to disappointment. One survivor recognizing another. "There's a bunkhouse on my property," he said. "Roof leaks when it rains. but it's dry enough most nights. You can stay there tonight. Tomorrow, we'll talk about work." It was not charity. It was not kindness. It was one survivor extending a hand to another. That night, Silas arrived at the ranch as promised. The two old soldiers sat on the porch as darkness crept across the valley like a slow tide, passing a bottle of whiskey back and forth, watching the stars emerge one by one in the vast Arizona sky. The Milky Way stretched overhead like a river of light, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled at the rising moon. "Blackwood's not going to stop," Silas said quietly. "That ambush today was a message, a warning shot. Next time, he'll send more men, better men. Let him come. Caleb?" Silas's voice carried a weight that only 20 years of friendship could earn. "I've known you since we were stupid kids who didn't know which end of a rifle to point at the enemy. You're the best shot I ever saw, and I saw a lot of men shoot during the war. But even you can't fight an army alone." Caleb took a long pull from the bottle. The whiskey burned going down, warm and familiar. "I'm not alone. I've got you. I've got Wallace." He nodded toward the bunkhouse, where a faint light glowed through the single window. "And now I've got her. The Apache girl? She tracked that coyote in the dark, killed it with one arrow, clean through the throat, and she spotted 3 things wrong with my property in 5 minutes that I'd missed for months." Silas grunted thoughtfully. "She any good with a gun?" "Don't know yet. Does it matter?" "Might." They sat in comfortable silence for a while. The kind of silence that exists between men who have said everything important years ago and do not need to repeat it. Then the bunkhouse door creaked open. Kaya emerged into the moonlight. She moved to the well, drew up a bucket of water, and paused, her head turning slowly toward the eastern hills. Her entire body went rigid, like a deer that had caught the scent of a wolf. She walked back to the house, knocked once on the porch railing, and spoke without preamble. "3 riders, half a mile east. They've been watching the property since sundown." Caleb and Silas exchanged a look that said more than words ever could. The war was coming. For 3 days the riders watched. Caleb never saw them directly. Blackwood's men were too careful for that. But Kaya tracked their movements with an almost supernatural precision, reading the land like other people read books. She showed him the signs each morning. Broken sage branches where horses had pushed through the brush. Fresh droppings at the ridge line, still steaming in the cold dawn air. Boot prints near the creek where someone had dismounted to observe the ranch through a spyglass. "They're mapping the property," she explained on the second morning, her voice quiet and matter-of-fact. "Learning your routines, when you wake, when you sleep, when you eat, when you're alone and vulnerable." Caleb nodded grimly. He had seen this kind of reconnaissance before, in the war, in the terrible days before a Confederate raid. The enemy always watched first, learned your weaknesses, found your blind spots, then struck when you were most exposed. He sent Wallace into town for supplies. The old ranch hand came back with a wagon full of ammunition, bandages, lamp oil, and dried provisions. His weathered face was pale, and his hands trembled slightly as he climbed down from the wagon seat. "Blackwood's been busy," Wallace reported, his voice low. "He's telling everyone in town that you're harboring a dangerous Indian. Says she's the one who shot up the saloon last week. Says you're plotting something against the decent folk of Dusty Creek." "And people believe him?" Wallace hesitated, glancing toward Kaya, who was repairing fence posts nearby. "Some do. He's rich. He's powerful. He owns half the businesses in town and holds mortgages on the other half." The old man shook his head sadly. "And folks around here, they don't trust her kind. Never have. Probably never will." Caleb checked the loads in his Winchester rifle, working the lever action to make sure it moved smoothly. "Then we'll just have to change their minds." Silas returned the next morning with 2 pack horses heavy with supplies, and he was not alone. 3 riders followed him through the ranch gate as the sun climbed over the eastern hills. Jake Harmon rode first, a former cavalry scout who had spent 10 years tracking Apache and Comanche for the United States Army before deciding he had had enough of that particular line of work. Behind him came Dutch Brennan, a red-haired Irish immigrant who could shoe a horse faster than any man in the territory and was not afraid of a fight. And bringing up the rear was Miguel Santos, a Mexican vaquero who had driven cattle herds from Texas to Montana and back again, and who owed Silas his life from an incident neither man ever spoke about. Found them at the Silver Dollar, Silas explained, dismounting and stretching his back. They're not fans of Victor Blackwood. Caleb looked at the motley group assembled in his dusty yard. Union, Irish, Mexican, Apache. 20 years ago, they might have been enemies. Now they were all the same thing, men and women with nothing left to lose and everything worth fighting for. Blackwood's got at least 15 guns on his payroll, Caleb said flatly. Maybe 20. We've got 7, counting Kaya. Dutch grinned, showing a gap where his front teeth used to be. I've faced worse odds than that, friend, and I'm still standing here to talk about it. Silas pulled Caleb aside while the others unsaddled their horses. There's more news about that federal marshal I mentioned. His name is Whitfield, James Whitfield. Word is he's been investigating Blackwood for months. Land fraud, bribery, maybe even murder. Think he'll actually do something about it? Depends on whether we can give him something concrete to act on. Right now it's all rumors and whispers. But if we could get someone to talk, really talk, with names and dates and details, that might change everything. That night they gathered around a fire in the yard. The flames cast dancing shadows across their faces as they passed around a bottle of whiskey and talked in low voices about tactics and supplies and fields of fire. It felt almost like the old days in the army, Caleb thought, that mixture of fear and camaraderie that came before every battle. And then Kaya spoke. She had been silent for most of the day, watching the newcomers with wary, calculating eyes, keeping her distance. But now, with the flames casting a warm glow across her face, she began to talk. Her voice was quiet, steady, like a river that had learned to flow around every obstacle in its path. Victor Blackwood hired men to clear Apache camps 3 years ago. They came at night, when the fires were low and the children were sleeping. They came with torches and rifles and no mercy in their hearts. She paused and the fire crackled in the silence. They burned our village to the ground. Every lodge, every storehouse, everything we had built over generations. My mother tried to carry my baby brother to safety, but they shot her in the back before she had taken 10 steps. She died in the dirt with her arms still wrapped around him. No one spoke. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. My people scattered south after that, looking for safety that does not exist. But I stayed. Her dark eyes lifted to meet Caleb's, and something ancient and implacable burned in their depths. I stayed because I wanted to watch him fall. I stayed because some debts can only be paid in blood. Caleb understood perfectly. Revenge was a fire that burned slow, but it burned forever. Then you're in the right place, he said. They came at midnight. Caleb was on watch, sitting in the shadows of the porch with his Winchester across his knees, when the first torch arced through the darkness like a falling star. It tumbled end over end, trailing sparks and smoke, and landed on the barn roof with a soft thump. And then the world exploded into flames. "Attack!" Caleb roared, bringing his rifle up and firing into the shadows at the tree line. Muzzle flashes erupted from the darkness. 5, 7, maybe 10 shooters, impossible to count in the chaos. Bullets tore through the night, punching holes in walls, shattering windows, kicking up geysers of dirt in the yard. The barn was fully ablaze now, flames climbing the walls and licking at the roof beams. Horses screamed inside, kicking at their stalls in pure animal terror. Silas sprinted across the open yard, his Spencer rifle barking death with every shot. Dutch and Jake laid down covering fire from the bunkhouse windows, their muzzle flashes strobing in the darkness. Miguel raced toward the burning barn, fighting to free the panicking horses before the whole structure came down on top of them. Wallace made it halfway across the yard before a bullet caught him in the leg. The old man went down hard, crying out, dark blood spreading across the packed dirt. Caleb grabbed him by the collar and hauled him behind the water trough, bullets whining overhead like angry hornets. "I'm all right," Wallace gasped through clenched teeth. "It's just the leg. Go. Fight. Don't you dare let them take this place." Caleb rose from cover. Spotted a shooter reloading behind the stone wall at the edge of the property. Squeezed the trigger twice in rapid succession. The man crumpled and did not move again. But there were too many of them. The attackers were spreading out, flanking the house from both sides, trying to catch them in a crossfire. In 5 minutes, maybe less, they would be completely surrounded. Then Kaya appeared. She moved through the shadows like she was made of smoke and moonlight, utterly silent, completely invisible, until the moment she struck. She carried no rifle, no pistol, just her bow and a quiver of arrows that gleamed orange in the firelight. One attacker dropped with an arrow through his shoulder, screaming as he fell. Another stumbled backward and crashed to the ground, a shaft buried deep in his thigh. She was not trying to kill them, Caleb realized. She was hurting them, driving them out of cover, pushing them toward the open ground where he and Silas and the others could cut them down with rifle fire. The tide of battle turned. 3 attackers were down, wounded or dead. 2 more fled on horseback, abandoning their comrades and disappearing into the darkness. The last of them, a thick-necked man Caleb recognized as Briggs, Victor Blackwood's right-hand enforcer, found himself cornered against the burning barn with nowhere left to run. Caleb approached slowly, his Colt leveled at the man's sweat-streaked face. "Drop the gun." Briggs threw his pistol into the dirt. His eyes were wild with fear, the primal, animal fear of a man who knew he was about to die. "Blackwood sent you." It was not a question. "I don't know nothing about—" Caleb cocked the hammer. The click was very loud in the sudden quiet, audible even over the crackle of the burning barn. "I was at Gettysburg, son. I watched men lie with bullets in their guts, trying to convince themselves and everyone around them that they weren't dying. You're a poor liar." He let the barrel drift upward until it was aimed directly between Briggs's eyes. "Talk, or I'll make absolutely certain you never talk again." Briggs broke. The words spilled out of him like water from a cracked jug. Blackwood had paid them to burn the ranch, kill anyone who resisted, and make the whole thing look like an Apache attack. Sheriff Grady was on the payroll and would swear he had seen Kaya leading the raid. The plan was to eliminate Caleb, have Kaya hang for murder, and buy the land at auction before the ashes had finished cooling. Silas stepped forward, his face grim and hard in the firelight. "What do we do with him?" Caleb stared at Briggs for a long, cold moment. The flames from the barn threw dancing shadows across his weathered face. Then he holstered his Colt. "We take him to town. We let the whole territory hear exactly what he has to say." Dawn came bloody and beautiful over the Arizona hills. The barn was a skeleton of charred beams and smoldering ash, still smoking faintly in the morning air. 2 horses had died in the fire. Wallace's leg wound was serious. He would walk with a limp for the rest of his days. But they were alive, and they had a witness. Wallace gripped Caleb's hand before they left, his weathered fingers surprisingly strong despite the pain. "You bring that bastard down," the old man said, his voice fierce despite his weakness. "I'll watch the property until you get back. Now go. Go and finish this." They rode into Dusty Creek at high noon, the hour when shadows were shortest and no man could hide, the hour of truth and reckoning. Caleb led the column, sitting tall in the saddle, his Winchester resting across his thighs. Silas rode at his right shoulder, his Spencer rifle ready. Behind them came Jake, Dutch, and Miguel, spreading out through the square as they entered town, taking up positions at the corners and alleyways. Not threatening, just watching, making absolutely certain that no one got any ideas about an ambush. Kaya rode at the rear, her bow strung, a quiver of arrows within easy reach. Briggs was tied to his horse in the middle of the group, gagged and bound, terror swimming in his bloodshot eyes like a drowning man going under for the 3rd time. The townspeople stopped and stared as they passed. Conversations died mid-sentence. Women pulled children indoors. Men gathered in small, tight clusters, whispering and pointing. "That's Morgan. He's got Blackwood's man. Look at the Apache. Is that blood on her hands?" Caleb ignored all of them. He rode straight to the sheriff's office, dismounted in a cloud of dust, and waited. Sheriff Tom Grady stumbled out the door, his hand hovering near his holster, his face going the color of old milk when he saw Briggs tied and gagged. "Morgan, what the hell is this?" "Justice," Caleb said. His voice was flat, hard, and carried across the crowded square. "This man has confessed to arson, attempted murder, and conspiracy to commit fraud. He says you're involved, Tom. He says you're on Victor Blackwood's payroll. The crowd pressed closer, 100 ears straining to hear. Grady's hand trembled near his gun. That's absurd. That's slander. I'm the law in this town. The law! Silas stepped forward, his voice booming like cannon fire. You took bribes from Victor Blackwood for years. You turned a blind eye while his hired guns burned ranches and terrorized honest folk. You helped frame innocent people for crimes they never committed. He spat in the dust at Grady's feet. You're not the law. You're a coward with a tin star pinned to your chest. Grady's hand tightened on his pistol grip, and then a new voice cut through the tension like a cavalry saber. Hold it right there! A tall man emerged from the hotel across the square. He had a gray mustache, hard eyes that had seen every kind of wickedness the frontier could offer, and a silver federal marshal's badge gleaming on his chest. Two deputies flanked him, their hands resting on their holstered weapons. I'm James Whitfield, the marshal announced, his voice ringing with authority. United States Federal Marshal Service. I've been investigating Victor Blackwood for 6 months. Land fraud, bribery, corruption of public officials, and conspiracy to commit murder. He nodded toward Briggs. And now, thanks to these men, I finally have a witness who's willing to testify. He turned to face Grady, and there was no mercy in his expression. Sheriff, you are hereby relieved of duty. Hand over your badge, now. Grady's face crumpled. For one long moment, he looked like what he truly was. A small, frightened man who had sold his soul one piece at a time, and only now realized he had nothing left to show for it. He unpinned the tin star from his chest with shaking fingers and let it drop into the dust at his feet. Victor Blackwood appeared at the edge of the crowd. Unlike the broken sheriff, he showed no fear. His expensive black coat was immaculate, not a speck of dust on it. His silver hair was perfectly combed. His eyes burned with the kind of fury that had driven him across a continent and through 20 bitter, hate-filled years. This is an outrage, he snarled, pushing through the gathered townspeople. You're taking the word of outlaws and savages over mine? Do you have any idea who I am, what I've built, what I represent? Caleb stepped forward. The two men faced each other in the center of the square, with the entire town watching. 20 years of hatred hung between them like smoke from a distant fire. I know exactly who you are. Victor? Caleb's voice was calm, almost gentle, the way a man speaks when he knows he has already won. You're the same man you were at Appomattox, a coward who couldn't accept defeat. You lost the war. You lost your plantation. You lost your slaves and your honor and everything you thought made you a man. And instead of learning from it, instead of growing, instead of becoming something better, you let it rot inside you until there was nothing left but poison. Victor's hand moved toward his coat, toward the pistol he kept there. Don't! Caleb did not raise his voice. He did not need to. I've got 6 rounds in this Colt, and I've been waiting 12 years to use them. Give me a reason. For a long, terrible moment, the two men stared at each other across the dusty square. The crowd held its breath. The wind died. Even the horses stood perfectly still, as if the whole world was waiting to see what would happen next. Then Victor Blackwood's shoulders sagged. The fire died in his eyes, leaving behind nothing but ashes and the bitter dregs of a life wasted on hatred. Marshal Whitfield stepped forward with a pair of iron shackles that gleamed in the noon sun. Victor Blackwood, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, arson, land fraud, and corruption of public officials. The shackles clicked shut around Victor's wrists. He did not resist, did not speak. Just stared at Caleb with empty, defeated eyes as the deputies led him away toward the jailhouse. The trial was swift. Briggs's testimony, combined with 6 months of evidence the marshal had painstakingly gathered, proved overwhelming. Victor Blackwood was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. Sheriff Tom Grady got 5. The remaining conspirators scattered to the wind, knowing that Arizona territory had suddenly become very unhealthy for men of their particular profession. 1 week later, Caleb stood on his porch as the sun painted the western sky in shades of orange and gold and deep, bruised purple. The barn was still a skeleton of charred timber and collapsed beams, but fresh lumber was stacked nearby, pale and clean and smelling of sawdust, waiting. Tomorrow the rebuilding would begin. Jake Harmon had tipped his hat and ridden west toward California, talking about starting fresh in a place where nobody knew his name. Dutch Brennan had returned to his forge in town, where he could be heard hammering steel at all hours. Miguel Santos had vanished south, muttering about cattle drives in the open range. But all three had made the same promise before they left. If Caleb Morgan ever needed guns again, they would come running. Silas walked up with 2 cups of coffee, steam rising into the cooling evening air. "Hell of a week," he said. "Hell of a life." They drank in comfortable silence, watching the colors bleed slowly across the sky. The kind of silence that exists between men who have said everything important long ago and find peace in each other's presence. "You know," Silas said eventually, his voice thoughtful, "when we were lying in that field at Gettysburg, listening to the wounded crying out for water in the darkness, I never thought we'd make it home. I figured that was it. Our last sunset, our last breath." He took a sip of coffee and smiled. "Now look at us, old men on a porch, drinking bad coffee, still breathing." Caleb smiled back. "Wouldn't have it any other way." Footsteps approached from behind. Kaya walked around the corner of the house, her canvas pack over her shoulder. She looked ready to travel. Caleb turned to face her. "You leaving?" She hesitated for just a moment. "My people moved south after the burning. I should find them. Tell them that Blackwood is finished. Tell them they can stop running." "You should." She studied him for a long moment. This hard-weathered man who had treated her as an equal when the rest of the world saw only the color of her skin and the blood of her ancestors. "You gave me something," she said quietly. "What's that?" "A chance and respect. Those are rare things out here." Caleb nodded. "You earned them, both of them. And if you ever need a place, work, shelter, whatever, you've got one here. That's not charity. That's just the truth." Kaya almost smiled. It transformed her face, made her look young for the first time since he had met her. "Maybe I'll come back," she said, "when the barn is finished." "It'll be here. So will I." She mounted her small pony and turned toward the southern hills. For a moment she sat silhouetted against the fading sky, a figure out of legend, or perhaps simply a young woman who had survived more than anyone should ever have to survive and come out the other side with her spirit unbroken. Then she rode away, and Caleb watched until she disappeared over the ridge. Silas clapped a hand on his old friend's shoulder. "She'll be back." "Maybe." "No, maybe about it." Silas chuckled, a warm sound in the gathering darkness. "You gave her something nobody else in this whole godforsaken territory had the basic decency to offer." "What's that?" "A fair shake." Caleb did not answer. He just looked out at his land, scarred by fire, marked by violence, but still standing. Like him, like Silas, like all the men and women who had fought beside them when the odds were long and the night was dark. The West was hard. It took everything you had and then demanded more. It did not care about your past or your hopes or your fears. It just kept coming, day after day, relentless as the sun, unforgiving as the desert wind. But sometimes if a man stood his ground, if he fought for what was right, if he chose his friends wisely and never forgot the difference between justice and revenge, sometimes the West let him stay. Some said Caleb Morgan was the luckiest man in all of Arizona territory. Others said he was the toughest son of a bitch they had ever had the misfortune to cross. But those who knew him best, those who had fought beside him, bled beside him, watched him stare down death without so much as blinking. They knew the simple truth. Caleb Morgan was a man who refused to quit, and in the West, that was enough.